Our day will flow in the following way. First, Sister Kathy Duffy will introduce our speaker. After the lecture, we will go into breakout rooms for small group discussion. And finally, we will meet back in this room for questions and conversation. Sister Kathy?
So thank you, Patrick. I'm truly honored to present this evening's lecturer, Dr. Philip Clayton, president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization. Phil is no stranger to our institute here at Chestnut Hill College. In 2015, he delivered a very insightful lecture entitled, "What Emergent Minds and Cognition Tell Us About Faith." And we still have a copy of the recording on the Institute's website for those who might wish to view it. Phil also helped our advisory committee think about the future of our institute and provided us wonderful guidance. Dr. Clayton comes well prepared for this evening's task. He earned his doctorate in the joint departments of philosophy and religious studies at Yale University, and since then has had a brilliant career in the burgeoning area of science and religion. He presently serves as Ingraham Professor as well as Joint Professor in the Department of Religion at Claremont School of Theology. Over the years, he has held administrative positions, visiting lectureships. He's received fellowships, written many books, and has served as a longtime advisor to the John Templeton Foundation. But recently, Phil's career has taken somewhat of a turn from his past activities. Now, as president of the Institute for Ecological Civilization, or EcoCiv for short, he encourages collaboration among government businesses, among government, business, and policy leaders at the international level, with an eye to furthering a much-needed transition toward a sustainable civilization. And I'm sure all of us, look forward to hearing some aspects of your work, Phil, but I am also interested in the connections you see between ecology and theology. Clearly, if better integrated with ecology, theology could play a significant role in this endeavor and provide us with a hope that will encourage ever greater response. And it's a wonderful coincidence tonight that as world leaders struggle in Egypt at COP27, searching for ways to deal with our present climate crisis on a global scale, we are here with a scholar and activist whose work with EcoCiv is impacting so many areas of the world. My desire is that Phil's passion and action in the world will inspire each of us to make the large and small choices needed to encourage that transition so that the world we are leaving to our children will truly flourish. I look forward to your theological reflections on this most critical issue of our time, Phil, and thank you for taking time from your very busy schedule to join us here. And so now I ask our participants to join me in welcoming Dr. Phil Clayton to this evening's Institute gathering. Phil.
Thanks very much, Kathy. It's really good to be here. I think it's amazing that the technology allows us to have 67 people gathered together, whereas in the past we might have had how many at Chestnut Hill? And I think that it's fantastic that we have that opportunity. I know a number of people in the audience, and it's great to see you after a long period of time. You can see the title on the screen in front of you. I'm not going to pull my punches. I want to go ahead and make this as firm and powerful a talk I can in the next 45 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, if anything has been scientifically established, it's anthropogenic climate change. As we learned this last summer, climate disruption means floods and droughts and fires and levels of social and economic disruption we could hardly have imagined even a few decades ago. I'm not going to do all the data, but just to get us be reminded of these lines. We can see the rapid increase in emissions, the gases that are warming the planet and causing those droughts and floods over these last years. We're talking now a level of 10,000 million metric tons of carbon a year. We are almost to the end of the carbon budget that would allow us to stay under 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. When you look at it in a historical graph, it's even more frightening and more clear that it was with the beginning of the industrial age, with the emission of greenhouse gases, that the lines started moving almost vertically upward. And finally, ladies and gentlemen, this is a justice issue. It's not just an issue of scientific numbers or parts per million of greenhouse gases. Look at the emissions over time by regions, or in one case, by countries. So we have East Asia and the Pacific at the bottom, Europe and Central Asia. Again, East Asia is a growing amount, that's China and India primarily, Europe and Central Asia. United States as the one large emitter mentioned by name, the largest emissions of any country in the history of the planet. And then look, for example, at Sub-Saharan Africa, the third line from the top at the very end. If you can see my cursor, you can see it right there. Africa has 15% of the world's population. It is responsible for 4% of the world's emissions. This is colonialism in its most dirty form, and I mean pun intended, that those who have done the emissions are causing the damage in one of the most vulnerable continents in the world, Africa, which is not responsible for what has happened. They suffer the consequences of our selfishness. If somebody asked me for a one-sentence definition of sin, that's what I would use. We have taken this beautiful Garden of Eden that we were given and turned it into something that bears the hand of man, and I use the sexist word on purpose, from the highest mountains, the top of Mount Everest, to the bottoms of the seas, where microplastics are assembling. Virtually every inch has been touched by human hand, and we've left our dirty mark. The result is eco-anxiety and a pervasive sense of hopelessness, especially in younger people. What resources, then, we have to ask, are available in the Christian tradition for addressing these challenges? Perhaps no other contemporary topic brings theology and the sciences closer together, more profoundly and more importantly together than this one. And it's certainly no topic on which the fate of the world's ecosystems more urgently depends. A year ago at this time, with other top people from EcoCiv, the Institute for Ecological Civilization, we were present in Glasgow for COP26, and we watched the activists excluded from the places of power so that we were left to march to sort of a people's park in the center of Glasgow, where a number of climate activists spoke. And this year now, the activists are kept apart from where the power brokers are, not even close to the barbed wire fence as we were last year. Even Greta couldn't have gotten to a place where she could be heard. And as you know, she chose not to come. She did give an incredible speech last year. 20,000 people marched through the rain on the Sunday, what would be this coming Sunday, in protest while the people were behind their closed doors, thinking of whether they would take action or not. I mean, these are absolutely crucial years and months and days for the future of our planet. Tonight, I would like to propose a theology that fully incorporates ecology into the very heart of its method and conclusions. And I think we'll discover some amazing and interesting implications for how we think about God and God's relationship to the world. What we'll be talking about is genuinely theology in a new key, not in an artificial sense, but in an organic way. And I dare say that it's an approach to theology that genuinely can bring hope. So this evening, I'd like to try constructing a theology for the age of climate crisis, not to argue that eco-theology might maybe be possible, but to try to construct one in your presence and for your consideration in the breakout groups. In short, I'm making the controversial claim that Christian theology and ecology can be fully fused. We use the name eco-theology for that fusion. And my question to you tonight will be, what will happen if eco-theology becomes the new systematic theology, the new constructive theology for the 21st century? By the way, what's the opposite of an eco-theology? Well, it's the kind of Christianity that denigrates the natural world, denies its value, and separates human from the surrounding environment and other animals. Some theologies historically seem to value only what's transcendent and timeless and non-physical. But these views, I want to show, don't represent the deepest strata of Christian thought, belief, and practice. By the way, siding with eco-theology does not mean siding with a political party. It doesn't matter whether you use the language of creation care, as political conservatives and religious conservatives tend to do, or the language of environmental justice, as progressives tend to do. Eco-theology encompasses both. Katharine Hayhoe, one of the most outspoken and well-known Christian scientists in the field, is an evangelical Christian. It does not mean a particular place on the theological or the political spectrum. It embraces both ends, I would like to argue. Also, remember, eco-theology does not need to be Christian. There are eco-theologies in Judaism and Islam and Hinduism. Non-theistic religions have deep ecological commitments. Buddhism, Confucianism, and virtually all of the world's indigenous traditions. But tonight's question is, if one begins with a Christian worldview, how might one construct an eco-theology for the 21st century? I'd like to do this in two parts. First, people always ask whether eco-theology is consistent with the central beliefs of the Catholic tradition. So let's take a few minutes first to look at traditional theology, to see how it can be interpreted from an eco-theological perspective. And then in the second half, I'll offer you a constructive eco-theology on its own terms. So the first question, can one affirm traditional or Catholic teachings of the church and be an eco-theologian also? Let's just take 5 examples of central doctrines, and I'll try to make this case. Number 1, the doctrine of God proper. Christianity has long held that God is not a solitary being, but a relational reality, a Trinity. Each member of the Trinity has a particular role within the Godhead. To take one example, the German theologian Wolfhard Pannenberg, under whom I studied, held that the Son eternally gives himself to the Father eternally accepts the Son's gift, and the Holy Spirit is the relationship of love and reconciliation that binds the Trinity into a unity. Theologians have used the term perichoresis to describe the interplay of the 3 persons. Perichoresis is like a divine dance, where the dancers flow in and out and across the same space without ever fully separating. Beautiful, cosmic, divine dance. Eco-theology affirms a similar, though not identical, relationship for the entirety of creation. All things are created, all things are connected, all are interrelated, all are part of the great dance of life. No living thing is solitary and isolated. All contribute to each other and are co-formed by the others. The giving and receiving that characterizes the Trinity also characterizes all created beings. We are imago Dei, in the image of God, the vestige of the Trinity, as the Latin phrase says, and that encompasses the entire biosphere as we know it. One last point. The Trinity offers a model of the deepest possible connection between persons. The Christian tradition adopts a similar model for created beings. We too remain within that divine presence, engaging in an ongoing dance with the divine spirit, the Spirit of Christ. Eco-theology adds, not just we, but all of creation stands in this kind of relationship. Second traditional affirmation, the God-world relationship. Karl Rahner held that the immanent Trinity, or God's eternal nature, and the economic Trinity, that is God in interaction with the world, must be seen as identical. In Catholic thought, God is known through God's presence in the world. Creation reflects its divine source. Every part of creation is filled with and vivified by the Holy Spirit. This view is known in the contemporary world as panentheism. The world is within God, and God within the world, although the divine is also more than the world. So how does this relate to eco-theology? This view that God is in all and all is in God means that the world around us must be more than inert matter. All of creation is spirit infused. This connects us to all things. Think of the lines from Wordsworth's famous poem, Above Tintern Abbey, some of the most incredible words of a God-infused or sacred-infused world. He writes, "And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Through spirit, we are bound together with all of created reality." Still, biology tells us that mind and subjective experience emerge
Oops.
gradually as the... Kathy, did you lose me?
Yeah, you're all right now.
Okay. Yeah, do say oops, and I'll stop until you say you're all right now. It's a
Yeah,
good
all right.
partnership.
Yeah, okay, good.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, here's a place where emergence in biology and the thought of Teilhard de Chardin come together. That subjective experience emerges gradually as the complexity of the universe grows. So maybe we should say the deepest unity of all things comes from their divine source. And a second kind of connection, the unity of life, arises as living beings evolve. We therefore have reason to resist C.S. Lewis's understanding of the world. He writes in a book called Miracles, nature, well, at any rate, the surface of our own planet is perforated or pockmarked all over by little orifices, at each of which something of a different kind from herself, namely reason, can do things to her. If God annihilates or creates or deflects a unit of matter, he has created a new situation. Immediately, all nature domiciles this new situation, makes it at home in her realm, adapts all other events to it. Now, there are several things, many things wrong with these sentences. One is the sexism that has the male doing things to the female earth or nature through little orifices. And then whenever God randomly does something, annihilates, creates, deflects a unit of matter, all nature domiciles. She's a good homebody, and she domiciles the new situation that this male divine being has done, makes it at home in her realm and adapts to it. I just don't believe that's the kind of creation that the infinite God has engaged in with such deeply gendered role in the relationship with the divine and the created world. If this view represented the Christian understanding of the God-world relation, in fact, there could be no genuine eco-theology at all. By contrast, consider what Irenaeus wrote about the God-world relation. He writes, "For the glory of God is a living person, and the life of humanity consists in beholding God. For if the manifestation of God, which is made by means of the creation, affords life to all living in the earth, much more does that revelation of the Father, which comes through the Word, give life to those who see God." So this earliest doctor of the church affirms a living universe with its own laws and integrity, which reflect the interdependent nature of the divine and the God-world relationship. Let's consider Christology and whether we could have an eco-theology with a traditional Christology. According to St. Paul, Jesus is the firstborn of all creation and stands at the origin of creation, as in Colossians 1. The Spirit of Christ is in all things, John 14. Christ is also the connecting principle. All are one in him, Galatians 3:28. In theology, then, Christology expresses the deep interconnection of all things. So I believe in the Christian tradition, Christology offers a pathway to eco-theology. If all are one in Christ, then all are connected with each other through Christ. Over the centuries, the church has often stressed that the physical universe is encompassed by God and that all human beings are to be united in Christ. But for some reason, Christians have found it harder to conceive all of life Christologically. Well, for an eco-theologian, the connection of all life is not just that it can be traced back to a single common cell, which developed by evolutionary principles into the myriad forms of life that we see around us. Instead, we affirm the natural science of evolution, for example, that all life may have originated from a first organism, but we also affirm the spiritual unity that binds together all living things. The Spirit of Christ is in all life, drawing all living things together into a unity. All right, two more. Pneumatology. So in traditional teaching, life is a product of the Holy Spirit. John 6, it is the Spirit who gives life. So what is that mystical principle that connects all living things? Theologically, it is the Spirit. Psalm 104, you send forth your Spirit, they are created. Life then is not a purely physical reality. Thomas Hobbes was wrong to reduce all things to mere matter in motion. Instead, biology reveals the emergent complexity of living organisms, which cannot be explained by physics or chemistry alone. Likewise, the work of the Spirit is not limited to humans alone. It encompasses purely natural systems. So Isaiah 32, until the Spirit is poured out upon us from on high, and the wilderness becomes a fertile field, and the fertile field is considered as a forest. It's the pouring out of Spirit that leads to these emergent features in the natural world. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead challenges this idea of dead matter. For him, all matter is living matter. Now, it may or may not be true that all physical things have mind. So some of us on this call are panpsychists and believe that in everything that exists, there is mind. Others think that mind emerges over time. But surely, for even traditional Christian theology, living organisms constitute a kind of living matter. We have to say that all life forms are vivified by Spirit and connected by Spirit. All right, let me close the first half with the doctrine of the sacraments. Over the last several decades, there's been a movement within Catholic theology to understand sacrament and sacramentality in general as extending beyond the 7 sacraments affirmed by the Catholic tradition, we are drawn to understand all things as having a sacramental existence. This movement is therefore called pan-sacramentalism. Pan-sacramentalism. A sacrament traditionally is a religious sign or symbol in which a sacred or spiritual power is transmitted through material elements, which become channels of divine grace. St. Thomas wrote that anything that is called sacred may be called sacramentum, or sacrament. The notion of sacrament may thus be extended so that it encompasses all things that are sacred. All things therefore become signs of the divine grace, including the evolutionary process itself. Throughout nature, then, we see signs of a future divine reality, currently hidden, but someday to become manifest. The natural world signals and participates in its divine source. Pan-sacramentalism asks us to learn to see all things, ta panta, all things as sacraments. All are bound together in one sacred whole. And as sacraments, each one is to be preserved and protected. Right, we could spend much more time, and maybe in the discussion we will, arguing about the fit, or some of you may argue the non-fit, of eco-theology with the great Catholic tradition. I think that the answer is fit, but that is something that you may want to debate. Now let's make the transition to eco-theology proper. And I want to start with a word of transition. We found, I think we can recognize that every theology speaks to its particular age. What is the theology that best speaks to this age of science, to today's world, and to the ecological crisis? I think it's hard to deny that all theologians are responding to the world around them. St. Augustine was influenced by the dangers of Manichaeism, and toward the end of his life by the collapse of the Roman Empire. John Scotus Eriugena responded to Neoplatonism and mysticism, as did many of the great women mystics of the late Middle Ages. St. Thomas wrote a theology for a universe ordered under the timeless will of God. Luther and Calvin were likewise children of their age, and much modern theology is responding to the increasing power of science, sometimes embracing it and sometimes pushing back against it. Now, you see the paradox here. Each theologian tries to state the timeless truths of Christianity, yet all of them state their insights using the specific languages that are available to them, which are most definitely not timeless. In short, theological language is deeply driven by cultural and historical differences. By the 21st century, this fact is hard to deny. Karl Rahner was the voice needed at the time of the Second Vatican Council. Liberation theologians responded to the injustices wreaked upon the poor in Latin America. And likewise for Korean theology, Minjung, for Black theology, in James Cone and others, we can think of many, many examples. So, ladies and gentlemen, my thesis is simple. Eco-theology is the Christian response to the defining features of our age. Eco-theology is where theology meets ecology. And today, theology must meet the ecological sciences in order to speak to our world. It's only been in the last few decades that scientists have realized that humans are now the dominant geological force on this planet. That is the force that changes the surface of the earth more than any other single force volcanoes or whatever, that humans influence the environment of the earth more than any other force. That's why we call this new geological age the Anthropocene. By the way, there's a huge debate about when the Anthropocene started. It's pretty widely agreed among scientists that we're there. My own position, along with some others, is that we date that back to 1952 or 53, when open nuclear tests, so tests of nuclear thermal weapons, were carried out in the South Pacific largely, but elsewhere. And soon after those, Geiger counters could detect higher radiation around the entire planet, up in the highest mountains, the valleys, the sand of the Sahara. That's the place where visibly and measurably humans had affected the radiation levels on the planet as a whole. Now, where are we today? Either humans will respond to the rapid warming of the planet, taking steps to reduce carbon emissions, decisions being made at this very moment at COP27 in Egypt, or we will fail to respond. Whether we respond appropriately or not, our choices are already having massive effects on ecosystems around the world. Greenhouse gases are at their highest levels in 4 million years. Ecosystems are rapidly being destroyed by climate change and human encroachment, and species are going extinct at a faster rate than in hundreds of thousands of years. These are the defining issues of our age. A few minutes ago, I showed the compatibility between some of the major Christian doctrines and eco-theology. Now it's time to focus on what eco-theologians affirm as the heart of Christian faith and practice. What are our central commitments? I define the heart of eco-theology in 3 words: panentheism, emergence, and interdependence. Each of these terms describes the kinds of practices that we are called to in this age, the kinds of sacred practices, the kinds of sacramental practices. Let's look at them one by one. Number 1, panentheism. This is the view that God permeates the world and all things exist within this divine presence. You can be a naturalist or a scientist and still be a panentheist. This theology affirms the laws of nature and the integrity of the natural order. And yet it also affirms that this same natural order exists within an all-permeating divine presence. If we were nerdy, we could talk about the theory of double causation from Thomas Aquinas, or in the work of the Thomist Austin Farr, many other thinkers, but today we don't, at least right now, I won't get nerdy on you. Panentheism implies that the patterns of the natural world can be studied in 2 different ways and described with 2 different languages. The panentheist fully affirms each of the natural scientific accounts: physical cosmology, quantum physics, solid state physics, chemistry, evolutionary biology, evolutionary psychology, biocultural studies, all of the evolutionary sciences. At the same time, panentheists look for analogs between the scientific results and the language of spirit, emphasizing the sacred nature of the natural world. In short, we can now see that eco-theology stands at the boundary between these 2 languages, specifically between theology and ecology. Maybe you'll allow me to give a personal example from the heart. My family has resided in Northern California for 5 generations, matrilineal. My home ecosystem is the giant coastal redwoods, wreathed in fog, with the sound of the crashing waves in the background. Sometimes we walk through the redwood forests with the eye of a botanist, exploring flora and fauna. At other times, we walk meditatively through the forest in the late afternoon. The sunbeams angle through the trees, which stretch up into the darkening sky like a living cathedral. At these times, our response is religious. Ecotheology embraces both science and spirit, proclaiming the harmony of the two. It sees Earth as a great cathedral, pointing upward, but also embracing all living things as part of one holy and sacred assembly. As the famous environmentalist Aldo Leopold wrote, "A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." The second foundation of ecotheology is emergence. Life developed from simple prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells, so gradually becoming multicellular. Cells took on different functions. The complexity of life forms increased. Aquatic life moved onto the land at multiple points, evolving new forms and structures, adapting to its environment in new and often surprising ways. As the dinosaurs died out about 65 million years ago, mammals begin to expand and develop. Paleobiologists trace the lineage from these little mammals to Homo sapiens. The core premise of modern biology is that even though life developed in different lineages,
Say that
our
again.
living beings have a common origin. We are different in our structures and behaviors, but we are not ontologically different. The difference between a bonobo brain and a human brain is only a difference of size and complexity, although the two different kinds of brains produce behaviors that appear to be qualitatively different. Bonobos remain our cousins. Ecotheology celebrates the common lineage of all living things. We are part of the same story. We have a common origin and a common destiny. We are part, but only a part, of the glorious emergence of life. Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry in The Universe Story put it beautifully. The important thing, they say, is that the story as told here in The Universe Story is not the story of a mechanistic, essentially meaningless universe. It's the story of a universe that has from the beginning its own mysterious self-organizing power. David Ray Griffin, the process thinker, writes in his book, The Reenchantment of Science, "A re-enchanted, liberating science will be fully developed only by people with a postmodern spirituality, in which the dualisms that have made modern science such an ambiguous phenomenon have been transcended, and only in a society that is organized for the good of the planet as a whole." So wise words, written 30 years ago, by the way. And finally, I think we'll stop there. The final feature of ecotheology is interdependence. Here, ecology and theology unite most clearly. No life form lives independently of its ecosystem. A functioning ecosystem is affected by all of the species that inhabit it in all of their myriad interactions. And every individual is affected by its ecosystem. Now, in one respect, this biodiversity is very similar to cultural diversity. It's an indispensable resource for all who share it. Cultural diversity offers multiple behavioral options and different ways to think about the world, which gives us as humans more options for overcoming problems and challenges. It's the same with biodiversity. Biodiversity, with its rich gene pool, gives all the life forms in a particular ecosystem the best chance of surviving external changes and threats, which is why the loss of species really, really matters. Now, ecotheology is the celebration of this interdependence of all life forms, the celebration of interdependence. It challenges attempts to separate humans out of their natural environment. It urges policies and lifestyles that preserve all living things and preserve the ecosystems on which we rely. As a theology, it motivates these attitudes not only through the sciences of ecosystem studies, but also through the theology of creation care. Say a word about that. According to Genesis, God placed humans on this garden planet with the charge to tend and cultivate it. Now that we have entered the Anthropocene, again, the era in which humans absolutely dominate the world's ecosystems, we hold their life, their throbbing heart in the palm of our hand. In this era, the responsibility of creation care deepens. A few months ago, for the first time in more than 200 million years, the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere reached 421 parts per million, up 71 parts per million from pre-industrial levels. Without concerted and rapid action, these gases could raise global temperatures as much as 4 degrees Celsius. And that's 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit. 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit. If that occurs, many regions of the world would become uninhabitable. The polar ice cap will have disappeared. Many regions of the world would be without water or farmland, and the oceans would be largely empty of fish. For ecotheology, avoiding this outcome is not only a biological challenge, not only a human-centric challenge, it's a challenge for religious people to respond to as well. Religion, including both its beliefs and practices, can be a or even the major motivation for environmental action. I'd like to conclude now with the challenge of hope. Many people today find the struggle with hopelessness to be one of the most crippling challenges. I convened a climate scientist for a meeting at the Harvard Center for the Environment in early May with the Templeton Project. And in the months leading up to that meeting and at the meeting, the major thing that I had to struggle with as the moderator was the hopelessness on the part of those who know the climate data most deeply. It's not just lay people who struggle with hopelessness, it's the scientists themselves who struggle with this crippling challenge. With all the negative data, how can we be motivated to fight for the environment or even to change our lifestyles? And yet in the Christian tradition, hope qualifies as one of the 3 theological virtues in the same august category as faith and love. So I want to ask now in your discussion groups, maybe we can return to it. What are the connections between sacred and secular hope, and how can they enhance each other? First, think about the connections between sacred and secular hope and short and long-term goals. So these are sacred and secular hope can involve either short or long-term goals. Both sacred and secular hope admit the risk of failure. Both can be so strong that the actor is willing to take on grave risks. And both kinds of hope not only motivate, but guide people's actions. Both have powerful effects, even when actual belief in the hoped for outcome is lacking. Hope transcends belief, or in the title of a book that I'm working on right now with a co-author, hope beyond belief. To hope for a sustainable form of human life on this planet, an ecological civilization, as we say at EcoCiv, that affects how we live our lives now. We begin to live in ways consistent with the outcome that we're working toward. Our actions participate in the very future we're seeking to achieve. Your actions today become symbols of the future you hope for. In fact, I would say our actions to bring about a sustainable civilization on this planet become sacramental actions. A sense of sacramentality that one can even use in secular contexts as well. The quest for an ecological civilization is an incredible example of a deeply engaged participatory calling. In Latin, we say vocatio, a vocation. Because it turns out there's a continuum from the sacred to the secular hope and from the secular hope to the sacred hope. They are not completely separate. And I want to conclude by speaking of their relevance to climate activism, to the people who are now in danger in Egypt to speak out against oppression and to speak out against the selfishness of businesses in some countries. Working toward genuinely sustainable forms of human life on this planet isn't about some external causal chain that you set in motion, like buying a lottery ticket and then either winning or not winning at the end of the day. Activism has to be consonant with, it has to be united with the final goal that you're working toward. And in that sense, it's sacramental. Let me conclude. Ladies and gentlemen, above all, eco-theology turns the affirmation of human dominance on its head. It recognizes it's humans who are dependent on the biosphere as a whole, on Gaia, as some people call it. If we create an environment where only a few of us can live, or even if our species disappears, the biosphere remains. Without us, climate disruption will continue for some centuries or millennia, but it will pass. It's of no great consequence for the biosphere as a whole, which self-regulates. The greenhouse gases gradually settle, new species evolve that are adapted to this new world. It's not the world that depends on us, but we on it. Tonight, we've seen that eco-theology combines ecology and theology, but both sides call for humility. Humanity is tiny compared to the biosphere as a whole, just as we are tiny in comparison to an infinite God. Both remind us of our place in the universe. And I just want to give the nihilistic words of Nietzsche to contrast with eco-theology in the closing. He famously wrote in the early journals, actually, once upon a time in a distant corner of this universe with its countless flickering solar systems, there was a planet. And on this planet, some intelligent animals discovered knowledge. It was the most noble and most mendacious minute in the history of the universe. But only a minute. After nature had breathed a few times, their star burned out, and the intelligent animals had to die. We believe in a different long-term story, but our dependence on the universe, on the sun and this planet, is just as indisputable for the eco-theologian as for the nihilist Nietzsche. If we live within our planetary boundaries, or if we live a life of humility before God, we and our children and their children will survive and thrive. But if we have the hubris to think we control everything, if we build towers of Babel that seek to usurp the place of God or Gaia, well, it will not go well with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, I suggest we take our guidance from the wisdom of ecology and the wisdom of theology. Eco-theology is nothing less than the fusion of the two. Thank you very much.
Oh, Phil, thank you very much. I just wanted to, my first real impression off of this is I very much appreciated your use of Wordsworth and Tintern Abbey because your entire speech had the feel and tone of poetry.
Thank you.
So what we want to do now is to look at the chat. I don't see anything in the chat yet, except that this is interesting. Donna Zorweth says that psychology.
Just on a Z, Kathy.
What's that?
Just on a Z. It's easier.
Oh, Donna Z. All right, good. Thank you. Psychology at Penn State's groundbreaking survey concluded that the only thing that human beings cannot live without is hope. So maybe you wanted to say something about that, Phil, until we fill up the chat box. Besides beautiful.
I think Donna and the study at Penn State is exactly right. You think of some of the writings during the Holocaust from concentration camps, and where there could be a community of people who could be supportive, who could find some amount of humanness in the midst of that dehumanizing and murderous environment. There was hope. Langston Hughes has an incredible poem, "What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun?" And I think that's the wisdom of the Christian tradition, to speak of hope, faith, and love as the three theological virtues, the ones that are most dependent on the presence of the divine and are most godlike in their perceptions. I mean, the story of faith in Hebrews 11 is a story of, well, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things unseen. If hope dries up like a raisin in the sun, where could there be faith?
Mm-hmm.
So Donna, I think that's a deep, deep insight that you've shared with the group.
Mm-hmm. Good. And group 2 discussed hope and whether we will act fast enough. So we might have hope, but also, we need action, and how fast can we move?
Mm-hmm. We, in this book on hope beyond belief, we've struggled to understand the relationship of hope and trust and faith. Some of the most difficult questions that I've ever wrestled with in my theological career. I believe, and Steve Knapp, my co-author, and I believe that hope is an involuntary response. So if I deeply want some outcome, and I believe it's at least plausible that it could happen, then I find myself hoping. We sometimes call that hope beyond hope. So my beloved aunt is on the airplane, and we hear it went down in the ocean. And there's a chance that they say that some lifeboats got out, and that there could be survivors on the ocean. And she raised me like my own mother. How could I not hope? Whether I intend to or not, I just find myself hoping that she's on one of those lifeboats and will be rescued soon. Trust, by contrast, is often a decision. My son has let me down over and over again, losing the keys to the car. I'm rushing out late to work. He's not even here. Will the keys be on the hook by the door? And they aren't. And that evening again, he asks for the keys, and I say, okay, I'm going to decide to trust you one more time. But what about faith? And I'm going to say that faith is something added to hope. Faith is the action dimension of hope. Faith is hope with legs. And it's that state, we find ourselves hoping that the future state of the world will be better, that people will live in a more Christ-like way, whatever the thing is. And then we say, and hoping this, how can I not act in such a way as to bring it about? I'd like to see faith as an action word in that respect.
Mm.
Let me pause there because I see lots of messages coming up and let
A lot of them.
Kathy
Here's
see.
one that's a little connected. If we are to bring environmental awareness to the level of the sacred, what are some of the specific faith-based actions that we can do as individuals and religious communities? So if hope does emerge, into faith.
Yeah. I know how I want to answer, and maybe that'll prompt some more comments. So let me be brief. It is on the shoulders of all of humanity to not take the planet down with us, not to continue this incredible loss of species that we have, not to take actions in these next 20 years that will have ramifications for hundreds of years after us. So that's a general obligation on all human beings, not to be so selfish in the moment with our lifestyles and our desires, our overextended consumption, that we cause harm to people who have not deserved it, and harm for people who are generations away from being born. But within that general call, if I may, to all humans, are the religious people and religious communities. And what we can bring, I believe, is a crucial piece to the whole. As Christian communities, we bring the teaching of a God who became incarnate, a God who cared enough about the world to actually take on flesh. We bring the teachings of the oldest Christian hymn recorded in Philippians 2, that one who is in the form of God wouldn't count equality with God something to be grasped, but would empty himself. Greek is ekinosein, from which we get kenosis or kenotic theology. In some ways, the most Christ-like thing one could do would be to act against the injustice of overconsumption and on the side of those whose very existence is being torn away from them, like the Horn of Africa right now. And that we would pour ourselves out for that kind of justice. Similarly, for other religious traditions, we could talk about Buddhist or Hindu or Jewish responses. But for Christians, to take that general human call and to add to it the specifics of that call that we know rests upon our shoulders as followers of Jesus called to Christ.
So here's the Teilhardian question for you. Can you speak about the role of the noosphere in sacred hope? And does the noosphere include the complexity of human intelligence and cooperation only, or also the global intelligence of nature? And I don't think Teilhard is clear on that, so you might be clear on what you believe. Yeah, and what difference it makes.
You're going to get me in trouble here, Kathy.
That's what our group talked about a lot too, noosphere.
Great topic. So there are three things about Teilhard that I think are crucial for our response. And I think we can find them all in him, but we'd need another couple hours to work out the textual part. So the first one is emergence, as Kathy and Sister Duffy and I have talked about for many years, that it's constantly new forms of living and being and thinking on the planet, drawn by the divine from the omega, from the end, from the final point toward there. And so in each phase of emergence, there are new things that become possible. A noosphere, an interconnection of thought in the complexity of human intelligence, as Joan writes in the chat, and of human cooperation, is a new, I'd even say salvific possibility. That's the first. The second one is that it's not just human-centric, that they're all the forces of nature. It's nature that takes on the form of noosphere. It's all life that's making this journey. And then the third, that it is indeed we are all all living things are being pulled toward a telos, toward a final goal. And we need to live teleologically. To be a consumer is to live in the moment. To think about a sustainable civilization on this planet is to think teleologically. And I would now say to think theologically.
Hmm. And someone is praising you, Nelson Rivera, for connections between theology and traditional Christian beliefs. The incarnation of God matters. It's a lens to understand God's presence and interaction with the world. So I think you did a fine job. I agree with Nelson.
Thanks, Nelson.
And here's Di Shira from Australia. I have found the term ecozoic coined by Thomas Berry helpful in moving beyond the environmental and ecological. Also, I'm wanting to connect the emergence and interconnection together with the panentheism as part of our work as ecozoans in evolving, strengthening, and maintaining the noosphere. I have been working along this line through the Center of Ecozoic Studies, piloting ecozoic wisdom circles.
Di, that's it's beautifully written. And I just want to make sure that everybody knows the resource of the Center for Ecozoic Studies on the internet. I think it's spelled American style TER. And Herman Green has helped bring together powerful new forms of study in recent months and the last few years, really. So you can find it online just by searching those 3 words. And as Di said, there are many opportunities to get involved, like the Ecozoic Wisdom Circles. Thomas Berry, I cited earlier in the talk on the universe story, and but his writings more generally are incredibly helpful. Thomas Berry plays a major role in the Yale Center for Religion and Ecology with Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm. And that's another center I'd recommend to people who are interested, as Di is, in Thomas Berry's thought. In fact, their very last post, I believe, was about Thomas Berry. So again, that's the Yale Center for Religion and Ecology, Mary Evelyn Tucker. Let me pause there. There's so much more to say, but I just want to underscore the importance of what Di has written.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so many comments here. We had the grace of having 2 young people in our group, and therein lies our hope.
Amen.
So true, right?
Yeah.
And here's Patrick Macaulay. Why don't you read it yourself, Patrick?
Sure. For centuries, there has been an interpretation of Christianity that asks us to keep our minds on heaven and to see the earth as a dirty, sin-based place. You seem to be saying that we need to rethink the earth and the biosphere into the very sacred space that we used to reserve for heaven alone.
Yes, exactly. And I spent 8 years once writing a book called The Problem of God in Modern Thought, and watching the battle back and forth between those who would tie God more deeply to the world, which I think is incarnational thinking, is theological thinking, and those who would move God further and further away from the world and let it be the realm of science alone. And those who separated God and world believed that they were the ones preserving the purity of Christianity. They, by the way, were the ones who attacked those who would bring the 2 more closely, attacked Spinoza, for example, for the absurd idea that God could be present to evil. But I would say that the heart of the Christian gospel is that God is present to absolutely everything while remaining divine, and that there's no place where the good, the divine, is afraid of being corrupted by bodies, with their sexuality and their hungers and their waste products, but that there is nothing in this creative world that God cannot embrace and seek to redeem. So Patrick's comment is to have us recognize the earth and the biosphere as the very sacred space that religion and Christianity in particular are all about. A heaven separated from the world from ourselves is not a heaven we should long for or hope for. A heaven that can embrace us in our finitude and imperfection is the kind of heaven that inspires hope.
And Jason's comment, I think, is connected here. How best to what you're just saying, how best to make climate crisis personal enough to motivate change in behavior. So if we're thinking about going to heaven and not worrying about earth, but how can we even more and more motivate ourselves to change, personally motivate ourselves to change? Because it's so easy just to forget about it, and not see the big picture.
Yeah. It's a beautiful question. I have the privilege of leading a number of retreats on eco-spirituality, and would encourage you guys to attend such retreats as you're able. And that question always comes up. It's usually the major focus of the whatever teaching I would do during a weekend retreat. The answer is you have to love one corner of the universe. You have to love one bit of land or one ecosystem. As we did, I've done projects in many countries, and I'll always say, what is it that you can first love as uniquely your own? I was walking with Jane Goodall once by an old Second World War runway. We sat down on the broken concrete, and she drew attention to a flower that was growing up through the cracks. And Jane said, "That's why I founded Roots and Shoots." Asking children to take and care for some part of nature, because when you care for nature, you love it, you're involved, and then you understand what ecology is. So I'll often say to people, take your daily commute. If you drive 20 minutes somewhere, and maybe you drive along a creek or a river or past a field, choose some part of that you can love. Stop on a Saturday and clean the trash off of it, or help the river flow more freely, and sit and meditate in that one spot. Learn to love one spot. Friendships and marriages are about learning to love one person and through them to love all. I'd say the same thing is true of the environment. If you can't love one ecosystem, you can't love the planet as a whole.
I think I may remember that for a long time.
That's true. That's a good adage. So Ernie Tominga says, from an interview with Grant Morrison, capitalist consumer culture has clearly reached its limits, and we either advance to a more efficient, stable, less suicidal and aggressive engagement with other people and our environment, or we go extinct as a species, taking all the whales and tigers and gorillas with us before we even figured out how to talk to them and hear their stories. There are few options remaining.
Ernie, I can't add a single word to it. Ernie has put it absolutely powerfully. Beautiful.
I would like to read Nanette's from further down. She says, I'm a fairly hopeless person. It is only my tiny amount of Christian faith, a mustard seed, that gives me hope. Christianity does privilege hope and futurity. I see now that if I grow in my faith, I may find hope.
I don't think I can add to that, because Nanette names the struggle that we all have. We have hope like a faith like a mustard seed, and yet if we can grow in our faith, we can find hope. And by the way, that's the opposite of hope leading to action or faith. Now here it's faith as action, acting in a faithful way.
Oh, that's neat.
A hopeful way helps generate hope. And that's a deep part of Christian discipleship. We know that from the medieval Christian mystics.
Right.
Teresa of Avila, Catherine of Siena, talk about those actions, right? The mustard seed. You have to plant the mustard to get even the baby mustard seed level of faith. I don't know, Nanette, if that's exactly where you're going, but that's where it would take me.
Yeah.
I just want to thank you, because I do feel like you really helped me with my faith through this. I know you meant to help change the model a little bit, but by referencing some of the conventional aspects of the Christian faith, you really helped me with it.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Nanette.
And Tony Nash says the principle of communion means there is no inside and outside. The divine source creates through the relationships we have every day with every and any being. So,
There's deep wisdom in that, Tony.
mhm,
We have so much wanted to do inside versus outside, this immanent world versus the transcendent dimension. And worst of all, the in-group, which we protect, and the out-group, which we hate and commit violence to. And once, if we go with what Tony Nash has written, the principle of communion means there's no inside and outside. That means break beyond that dichotomy. Let the inside be the outside. The inner dimension of spirituality be the way that you walk in the world. Let the value of the divine transcendent permeate every millimeter of this world around us. It's the beginning of breaking down those dichotomies
mm,
that is for us the path of hope.
mm.
Ooh, Joan says here, do you see a parallelism between sacramental reciprocity of humans and nature and human to human? There can't be one without the other. We need to learn to trust the other and the fact that we need them.
Mm,
That speaks to me on a personal level as the father of an autistic son, who has found his connection with other life forms through animals first. At his college, he can talk or be more naturally with the raccoons and the deer and the turkeys on his campus than with the humans around him. But they have opened him up to find connections with human beings. For some of us, it's the opposite. Deeply loving those we're closest to allows us to learn to love nature. And Joan, I think that parallelism is powerful, and the fact that you call it a sacramental reciprocity is perfect,
mm.
just perfect.
Wonderful. And this will be probably our last comment, but I think it expresses my feelings for sure. This is Lance Powell said, this has been one of the most enlightening events I have attended in years. Thanks. And so
Well,
Patrick, you have something to say.
Somebody was jumping in?
Do you want to say something to end? Yeah, I think we should.
Miriam wanted to say something.
Who did?
I
Miriam.
said it, I totally agree. This is the most.
Oh, you agree.
enlightening.
Yes, I think a lot of us will agree with that.
I just
Tony?
want to say how much I'm counting on getting a recording of this so I can go over the ideas again and again.
Good, Tony.
It'll be really helpful. Thank you.
It seems as if we remember to record, so we're in good shape.
All right. I would like to thank everybody who came into the Zoom room with us today. We spoke a lot as the people in charge of this as to whether or not we'd ever be able to make the transition to Zoom. And the fact that you all show up every single time we put on one of these events, it's difficult to express how much we appreciate all the time and attention you put into participating. It really makes the whole event what it is. I'd also like to thank Phil one more time. I meant what I said earlier when I tried to express the idea that your entire speech had the air and the tone of poetry. And I think I wasn't the only one who was feeling that way. And as a person who has to put on presentations like this, I just wanted to thank you for the time and attention you put into producing it before we all got here today. I know that it must have taken you some time to put together such a beautiful piece that looks so effortless and seamless. Usually those are the kind of things that take the most work.
That's correct.
Thank you, Patrick. And to everybody, it was an honor to be present. Completely a joy. And I wish you, as a man I happen to respect a lot said, go thou and do likewise.
And thank you, Kathy, for making this available to all of us.
You're welcome. Yes, it's my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Looking for this for a long time.